Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome. It is always a pleasure to be in Singapore, but particularly today as we kick off this incredibly important event for our region and for our industry, an event that shines a light on that most important aspect of our digital world, operational technology. I did just want to very briefly take a moment to say a thank you to Minister Teo and to the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, not just for bringing us all together today and for putting on this fantastic event, but for your leadership and pioneering efforts when it comes to cybersecurity across our region and indeed on the world stage. In this dynamic cyber threat landscape that we all share, the CSA and Singapore have been at the forefront of fortifying the nation's digital infrastructure and really setting an incredible standard for our region, so thank you very much. I did also want to take an opportunity to acknowledge and to celebrate the MOU that we'll be entering into with the CSA today. It really is a wonderful opportunity for us to help uplift the ability to prepare for, detect and respond to the cyber threats that we're going to be talking about today. And we all know, everybody in this room would be aware that OT cybersecurity is an issue that extends far beyond any national boundary. And in the Asia-Pacific region, with our complex supply chains, our rapid technological advancements, and a really diverse range of industries, it's never been more important to have a collaborative approach to matters like this. So to the extent that we're able to use our technology and our expertise to help support those efforts, we're incredibly proud and certainly very excited to do so. The spirit of collaboration is perhaps the perfect segue to introducing Rob and the talk that he'll be doing today on the OT cyber threat landscape. This year, Dragos released our 6th annual Year in Review report, which is a resource for cybersecurity practitioners to get ground truth reality insights into what we've seen over the past year, actual threats and vulnerabilities that the team of experts and practitioners and researchers have come across. I know that this initiative, much like Singapore itself, is particularly dear to Rob's heart, and I know he's very disappointed that he couldn't be joining all of us in person for the event today. But with a baby on the way, I think he's probably made a smart decision to stay on the other side of the world. But no doubt he'll be back here next year. But just to very briefly introduce that year in review and why it's so important to us. It really wasn't that long ago that most of what we knew about OT cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities came from anecdotal insights and information that was shared word of mouth through a relatively small community of OT cybersecurity practitioners. And against a fairly opaque threat landscape, it is very difficult to craft appropriate controls to protect these environments. And oftentimes what happens is we look to IT and we have a look at what's working successfully in that environment, in that world of singular systems and a focus on data protection, and copy and paste that across into the OT environment with its many complexities and fragilities. And oftentimes what we found is that taking that approach is often ineffective, often overkill, and sometimes introduces more risks than what it mitigates. And so the idea with the year in review is to take these ground truth realities, what have we seen over the past year in terms of what adversaries are actually capable of, what are they not capable of, what does it look like, and allow asset owners and operators the information that they need in order to craft measured, impactful controls that are actually going to help fortify their defences. So here to share those insights now, I will hand over to a man who I'm sure requires very little introduction to this audience, the CEO and co-founder of Dragos, Robert Lee.
Thank you so much. And look, yeah, definitely hate not being able to be there in person for a variety of reasons. For years, I've been privileged to be able to teach Singaporeans in my role at the SANS Institute. And for years now, I've been able to be a part of the OTCEP. And as much as I'd love to be there, I feel having another kid is probably high on the priority list. My first child, I got away with testifying to the U.S. Congress while my wife went into labor, but I was about an hour from the hospital, so I thought it was an okay choice. Being roughly 16 hours worth of flights away, I think it was Zach Tudor who's in the audience with you, and I said, hey, I think I'll be there. And Zach privately messaged me something maybe along the lines of, if I'm being polite, you're an idiot. And so I decided to take Zach's wisdom, as I've often done in my career, and stay here. But let me first, again, pay respect to the Singaporeans and also just CSA and the OTCEP panel here. I mean, it's really impressive consistently what OTCEP has done and consistently what happens in Singapore. When we look at OT, we all can appreciate that that is the critical part of critical infrastructure. It's the reason businesses exist. We need IT. IT is absolutely a driving force for us, but the reason that it's critical infrastructure is OT. And there are very few countries who even tried, let alone succeeded, as Singapore has, in putting OT on the map. It's not simply a bullet point in a larger strategy. It is explicitly stated as a critical part of the national security strategy, and it's very impressive. Minister Teo, Mr. Ko, Mr. Anthony, folks that I am unfortunately not able to see today, thank you for your partnership over the years. It's really an honor also to be able to enter into the memorandum of understanding between us, and we look forward, even as a tech company, being able to bring in expertise and help. So without further ado, let me jump into the presentation. And I will say my only second biggest regret, besides not being there, is not being able to enjoy some good black pepper crab at Jumbo's. So I guess I'll forego that this year. We can skip past this slide. This was the introduction that Haley did. And here's where I want to start the presentation. And here's essentially what I want to accomplish during my talk here. We know that the frequency and the sophistication of these industrial threats are becoming more severe. We've heard that, we understand that, got it. But as Haley just noted, there's a lot of anecdotal insights. There's a lot of, well, I heard a thing, or I would tell you, but it's classified. And that's not really helpful when you're trying to actually explore what to do about it. So my presentation today is going to paint kind of a broad picture. I'm going to focus really on pipe dream, which Mr. Ko correctly identified in the beginning as a big topic. I talked about it a little last year, but it was very fresh and very new. Now I've had time to really analyze it. I want to bring out, what do we really need to take away from this? And then I want to close the presentation with a discussion of some critical controls. And as Haley was noting, we look to IT a lot of times, but what we don't want to do is just blindly copy and paste IT security best practices into our operational environments. As Mark Aiello, one another good of my friends, sitting there today, he will tell you that beyond the best intentions, blindly copy and pasting IT security into operation environments is a good way to cause disruption of those operations environments. I've been fortunate, probably the wrong word, but been fortunate to be involved in many of the large industrial attacks that happen around the community. And I've still responded to more well-intentioned IT folks taking down more facilities than a variety of state actors combined. So we got to balance the risk there. So I'll again start off with kind of high level, get into pipe dream, and then those critical controls that I think are important for us, the so what of the presentation. So first up, as we look at these industrial threats, I remember testifying to the US Senate in 2018. At the time, there was 6 or 7 industrial threats that we were tracking. And what I define as an industrial threat is those groups, those state actors that are explicitly targeted on industrial networks. They're not just targeting a power company or a port, but they're targeting a power company or a port or an oil and gas company because of their operations, because of the OT side of the house. That is what we would then consider kind of an industrial threat. And then when I testified the US government at that point, again, 6 or 7 of these existed at the time. And that was already pretty alarming. When I started my career in the US intelligence community, even having 1 or 2 that were actually capable was going to get you a presidential level briefing. To get to the point at an unclassified level, we could be talking about 6 or 7, really spoke not only to the increase in the threats, but most importantly, it spoke to the dedication of the industrial and asset owner community. Or said differently, we started looking more, so we started seeing more. Why weren't there a bunch of threats that we were tracking pre-2017, 16, 15, et cetera? Because not many companies were doing monitoring and detection response. A lot of them were putting all their focus on prevention. Let's segment away our industrial environment. Let's really focus on the firewalls. Let's try to keep these environments separate. And while those efforts can be helpful, the reality is if you're not turning on the lights inside the house, you're not going to see much. And so we weren't looking for threats, and so we weren't seeing them. When I went back and testified this last year to the US Senate, I had to tell them that we were now tracking 22 such threats. And so it's a combination of we're looking more, so we see more. That's good. And it's also a combination of various states and criminals around the world realize that there's a viability to targeting these industrial environments, not only for geopolitical purposes, but also intellectual property theft, also the ability to cause disruption in a way that influences populations. There's a variety of mechanisms as well as motives that gets put in place. But today, I really just want to focus on the two latest groups that we identified in this year in review and highlight those. So we can go to the next slide, and we'll start off with bentonite, which in any other year would be a main stage kind of presentation. Because of Chernovite and pipe dream, which I'm going to get to in a minute, I'm going to skim over bentonite a bit. But they are a group explicitly focused on espionage inside of oil and gas and manufacturing environments. And so what they've essentially done is shown the ability to compromise these organizations as they try to get into their operations environments to do intellectual property theft. Now, most people, when they think about intellectual property, think about recipes. They think about trade secrets associated with creating something. And that's a good way to look at intellectual property, but it's not all encompassing. A lot of your intellectual property is not stored in your enterprise IT servers. It's not in your emails. Most of the intellectual property of these companies at times can be in the industrial process itself. How did I build an industrial process and integrate it in such a way that I can take cheaper quality inputs and make higher quality outputs? It's not so much that I can make a new type of Kevlar. It's that I can do it in such a way that's efficient. I can do it in such a way that's economical. I can do it in such a way that takes advantage of the automation environment to build a company on the global stage that has the margins and quality to succeed. That is core intellectual property. Adversaries stealing things like engineering workstation documentation, engineering drawings, human machine interface screenshots, data historian inputs and outputs. All of that material can allow a company to be competitive when they previously weren't. It's an unfair competitive advantage to use criminal and states to be able to steal intellectual property of individual asset owners and operators. Bentonite represents one of those groups. If we go to the next slide, and many things that they do will not be surprising. Exploiting vulnerabilities in internet-facing assets, getting into an industrial environment, downloading malware. There's a lot of those things that remain consistent. What ends up being unique for a lot of these groups is when they get into the industrial environment, a lot of us as IT security professionals can get trained to look for vulnerabilities, exploits, and malware. And while those things do exist in industrial, and they take a different flavor than what we see in IT, a lot of the things we care about most with industrial adversaries is their ability to use the native functionality, to understand the industrial environment and the physical process and the control applications as if they were operators at that facility. I don't need a new exploit or vulnerability to download a logic file off of a controller. That's native functionality. Another good friend of mine, Eric Byers, sitting in the audience, has talked about this for years, about the native functionality that you can accomplish through a control system. Dale Peterson, another good friend, same thing. Hey, he talks about these insecure by design aspects. And regardless of what you label them, it's functionality that is present in these environments. And so only looking for the IT security style of things misses a big component of what adversaries can do in that environment. So bentonite represents one of those groups that we track, we think about, we're interested in, we want companies to be protected again. But it's not one of the ones that we freak out about. A lot of times things relating to critical infrastructure attacks and industrial espionage can get overhyped. We have a media report of, oh my gosh, there was a phishing email sent to a power station. The power grid's going to go down. And it's like, well, that's not how physics works. Calm down. There's steps involved here. And so at the same time that we want to highlight risk, we want to make sure that we're not overhyping the problem. However, I'm going to shift a little bit as we go to the next slide. And this is one of the threats that we've all been waiting on. And we never wanted it to manifest. But I mean, Zach and I have talked about what this was for years. This is essentially a capability, an adversary that we kind of all could predict was eventually going to come, but we were really hopeful wasn't. And unfortunately, it's here. So in early 2022, through the course of our normal business operations, Dragos partnered very closely with an undisclosed third party, as well as the US government, and was able to identify and analyze a capability we called Pipe Dream. And Pipe Dream is the attack framework, if you will. It's not just one piece of malware. It's much more like a Cobalt Strike for industrial, or a framework that can be reused. And it was developed by a group that we track as Chernovite. Now, all the names are really just made up. Don't over-index on those. But Chernovite makes this Pipe Dream capability. And I remember testifying to the US Senate in 2018, and I got asked the question, what keeps you up at night? And honestly, not a whole lot. My first kid hadn't come around, so I was sleeping pretty good. And at the same time, while I love our focus on cybersecurity, the reality is our industrial asset owners and operators have built really safe and reliable infrastructure. We benefit greatly from the focus on safety that they've put into the community over the years. And so I mentioned to the senators, I said, look, I'm not really worried about today. What I'm worried about is 4 or 5 years from now, as we continue to go from heterogeneous environments, or essentially an oil facility in Malaysia doesn't have a ton in common with an oil facility in Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have anything in common with an electric substation in Maryland. We have these heterogeneous environments. They're very different. But the thing that I see happening, and that others have talked about too, is we're moving from heterogeneous to homogeneous. We're moving to common operating platforms, common implementations, common protocols, common software stacks. And that commonality allows for a scalability on the behalf of the adversary. If I'm an adversary and I have to develop an attack that has physical consequence at a facility, if it's heterogeneous, the way I get in could be reused. The way I move around the network could be reused. But the actual implementation of the attack that caused a physical consequence is going to be very specific to that facility. And it likely won't scale to other facilities. And even if it does, it won't scale to other industries. But as we move towards homogeneous, the cost goes down for attackers because you can reuse capabilities. And as there's commonality in these systems, we enter into a phase where you could rinse and repeat an attack. You could create an attack with physical consequence that you go and move beyond facilities, beyond sub-industries, but even cross-industry. And that was the testimony I gave in 2018 saying, I'm worried about this. And 4 years later in 2022, that's what manifested. And it did not get all the attention that I think it should have gotten. It's one of the reasons I'm happy to give this presentation today. And the question is why? And the answer is quite obvious. Through the work of defenders, we were able to identify, analyze, and inform the global community about this threat before the capability was employed. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't deployed somewhere in the world, but it wasn't employed. In other words, it wasn't placed on its targets and it wasn't actioned yet. So the adversary developed the capability, was ready to go, had picked out targets across Western Europe and the United States, and was ready to launch an attack on critical infrastructure sites. But before they could launch that attack, the defenders got ahead of it. Now, that's a huge win. And as the minister was mentioning in her keynote, that's what it talks about with teamwork. When all of us can play to our strengths, when private sector companies like Dragos and many good other ones can bring their expertise, partner with government who has their roles and responsibilities and their expertise, to also partner with OEMs and manufacturers and asset owners and operators to bring their expertise, defense can win. Defense is doable when you do that. Now, the downside is we don't just get to claim victory. The reality is this isn't something you just patch away. This is a capability that works reliably and will continue to work reliably. So we bought ourselves some time, but I need people to understand this capability and defend against it because I'm worried that this represents a new trend. And if this capability were ever to get out, it wouldn't just be state actors, but it'd be criminal operators that could pick this up and use it quite quickly. Talk about the proliferation of industrial capabilities. So let's spend a couple slides quickly talking about it. So as we go to the next, essentially what makes this capability so impactful is it is the first time we've seen something that is scalable cross-industry that can do attacks. Now, we've seen espionage, but the ability to actually manifest a physical consequence as well as disruption, that's new when you talk about the ability to scale cross-industry. And essentially what Pipe Dream did is it's really just like a fancy engineering workstation software. It can take advantage of underlying software like Codesys, which is embedded in tens of thousands of controllers around the world. It takes advantage of common ICS protocols like Modbus TCP and OPC. It takes advantage of the way our systems are implemented to be able to move in the network east and west or laterally across the environment instead of just north and south, where a lot of people are actually placing their detection capabilities. Let's look what comes out of the substation versus let's look what happens in the substation. So it's taking advantage of a lot of these things. And in many ways, Pipe Dream was really just a best hits list. It took a lot of the capabilities that we've seen in the other industrial specific malware, made them better, and implemented it all in one framework. So it's really reliable, and it works in everything from an offshore ship to a carbon cracker on shore to a transmission substation to a servo motor on an unmanned aerial vehicle. It's very capable. Next slide, please. And as we think about this capability, we try to focus people not on indicators of compromise. How do I look for an IP address or a digital hash? That's the wrong way in many times to look for this. We try to focus people on look at the tactics and techniques or the methods they use. One common framework we refer to as the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS framework. That's a language that we use to communicate this. And what was interesting about Pipe Dream is Pipe Dream represented 46% of all known tactics and techniques and procedures that have ever been observed in industrial attacks. So my recommendation to the audience is you need to be prepared for ransomware across operations, and you're going to want to be prepared for industry-specific attacks that happened in your industry. Electricity industry, you should be paying attention to Ukraine. Oil and gas industry, you should be paying attention to Trisis and the safety system attacks. But beyond ransomware, the ubiquitous thing that you should care about is Pipe Dream. If you prepared to protect, defend, or protect, detect, respond, and recover to just Pipe Dream, you would actually cover a significant portion of the threats we've ever faced. So that talks about defense being able to be successful at scale. Next slide. Now, these next couple slides, I'm going to rapidly go through. I put them in here so they can be useful to you as resources, but just because we're focusing on the big ones like Chernovite and Pipe Dream doesn't mean that the others have disappeared. And as we look across these other groups that we track, they've consistently been active and targeting companies many times well outside of media and what gets published publicly. You know, as an example, even with Electrum, the group that was responsible for the 2016 cyber attack that took down electric power in Ukraine, they have still been active developing capabilities and employing them not only in Ukraine, but picking out targets around the world. Sometimes we as defenders have the bias of looking at something and going, oh, well, that happened in Saudi Arabia, or that happened in Ukraine, or oh, that happened in the United States, and think that it doesn't apply to us. When in reality, we are all very closely connected and we're all using the same type of industrial automation environments. And so those early examples end up just being harbingers for what's coming for the rest of us. And we need to take that time to actually defend. Next slide. So let's take just a couple quick ones. So Costivite is another group that we tracked just as an update to the threat landscape. What was quite interesting here is this was an adversary that gained access to the managed service providers, not like security providers, but like SCADA as a service type providers, compromised those organizations and pivoted down to renewable sites across 2 different continents. And so through one managed service provider was able to get through multiple power generation sites around the world, 2 continents specifically, and they were positioned in exactly the right locations in exactly the right ways to recreate things that we've seen before, like the 2015 cyber attacks in Ukraine. So when we look at this adversary, there's a lot of lessons learned here, and there's a lot of understanding that adversaries are actually getting not only capable, but now crossing that line of intent to actually do something harmful. but there's also optimism. The methods of these adversaries often overlap. And so while things like AI and quantum are going to introduce great advances for the industry, it's also important to understand getting the basics right, getting the foundations and fundamentals right is always a good strategy. And there's not AI required for learning how an attack took place before and applying that knowledge in the future. That's basically the genesis of threat intelligence. And it's a very important capability. Next slide. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Xenotime. Xenotime is the only group that's tried to kill people. Xenotime developed the Trisis malware that targeted the safety system in an attack in Saudi Arabia, cost something like $300 million in downtime and outages, but luckily didn't kill people, but the adversary tried. They tried to modify a safety system in such a way that they could have another event take place at the facility to kill people that were working that facility. So they are the most dangerous group, even if they're not the most capable. I'd say Chernovite and Pipe Dream is the most capable, but Xenotime showed the desire to try to kill people, and that's dangerous. Well, since their attacks in 2017, we've seen them consistently target oil and gas and liquid natural gas facilities across Europe, as well as a couple other places around the world. And remember, that's only based on our visibility. They could be more active, but just with the visibility we have, we see them be pretty active. And right now, we don't see them getting ready to deploy the next capability, or at least we don't see it. But a lot of what they're doing is reconnaissance, picking out the targets and very specific targets that have an oversized impact in energy supply across parts of Europe. So again, something that we need to pay attention to. Next slide. So as I go through all these things, I will say again, ransomware, it gets a lot of attention, but it is appropriate. It is the most likely thing that you're going to be facing. And a lot of the ransomware tactics and techniques do overlap with state actors. What I'll note about ransomware, though, is you'll note that a lot of the cases that we see happen in industries like manufacturing, and less so maybe in construction, as an example, or mining. Now, that's not to say that the adversaries don't want to target mining. What this says to me, and my assessment of this, is the industries that have become more digital and more connected have engaged and increased their attack surface in a way they're getting attacked. The mining industry, while advanced in many ways, is nowhere near as broadly connected and digital as what's happening in our discrete manufacturing industry. As a result, the more we see connectivity, the more the attack surface increases. Now, the takeaway is not don't connect. The takeaway is we need to layer in security for the digital journey we want to go down. Next slide. So the other thing that constantly comes up is a discussion about vulnerabilities. And what we consistently observe across this is that there's issues in the vulnerabilities, and we can continue the next slide as I say this, but more importantly, the vulnerabilities don't necessarily relate to risk all the time. And too many times people want to say CVSS scores and relate to risk. But as we look at them, a lot of them don't actually impact operations at all. Next slide. What we see instead is that a lot of time advisories come out and say patch or don't, without a lot of guidance. And there's a lot of things you can do besides patching a control system, turning off a service, blocking something in a firewall. But it's important to know what patch, or what vulnerability I should say, actually matters. Next slide. As we looked across, and our intelligence team has looked across every vulnerability that ever comes out, every year there's about 1,300 of them or so, we find that only 2% of them are the ones that you really need to address now. Well over 68% of them could just be handled in a next cleanup or downtime. And about 30% of them you should never worry at all. So a lot of times people want to say what their patch ratio is, or what percentage. And oftentimes we over-focus on vulnerabilities. And it's more important to be able to detect and respond to threats than just simply prioritizing patching. So we want to take an informed view here instead of just saying, oh, I've got a vulnerable control system, when in reality, it may not be something that actually introduces risk. Next slide. Now, as we sort of pull all this down, I don't have the time to go into this one, but I wanted to highlight this Rockwell case study. Essentially, the US government and Rockwell partnered together and then brought in Dragos as well as others to identify a state actor developing exploits against an unknown set of vulnerabilities in Rockwell products, then using the private sector capabilities like Dragos Neighborhood Keeper as well as others to go out and look how far wide it was and proactively help people. Again, going back to the minister's keynote, that's teamwork. And when we figure out how to work together, we too can stand up to state actors. So again, I know it's a bit of a tease, but I'd highly encourage you going and looking at this case study. It's one of the most impressive that I've seen in my career. Next slide. But in like the 2 minutes or so that I have left, actually you can skip this one and go to the next slide. But the 2 minutes I have or so left, I really want to talk about what we need to do about what we've seen. And I'll highlight that in our year in review reports, even though I don't need to brief it here, it all comes back to things we're seeing in the field, real things that have happened, real insights from our customers. And it's consistent that we as a community have placed a lot of focus on prevention, trying to stop an attack. If we don't amplify that with things like visibility, detection, and response, so the value in our prevention tends to atrophy over the years. It's not what we thought it would be. And because we're not looking, we're not informing what we need to do in prevention next. It's consistent. I see down there about 80% of the environments we go into, of the customers that are even, sort of mature enough to even come to us, about 80% have limited to no visibility in their environments at all. And that's a problem when you think about the global infrastructure community not even monitoring our critical assets. Next slide. So as we start wrapping it up, what do we do about all this? Well, of course, it goes back to the 3 T's that the minister mentioned, but one of the resources we hope to provide is a guide or a reference point about what specifically to do. If you go to the next slide, essentially what we did is over at the SANS Institute, so take it off my Dragos hat, Tim Conway and I went through and looked at every single industrial attack that ever happened, public and private that we know about, and said, what were the controls that were consistently valuable in all of them? Now, there's other security controls that matter, but what were the ones that were the obvious best bang for your buck? What were the obvious ones that were useful in all these attacks? And what we found is there was 5 of them. And we wrote a paper titled The 5 ICS Security Critical Controls. I hope you all go take a look at it. But it sets out a strategy for what to do and how to approach the problem, taking an intelligence-driven approach. And you can map it to NIST cybersecurity framework. You can map it to CCOP. You can map it to 62443. You can map it to these other standards, regulations, and frameworks that are out there. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. But this lays out a strategy about how to approach it, how to think about it, and why all these controls can work together to put you in an amazing place. Because the reality is, and this is the message I'll leave you with as we move to the panel, the reality is defense is doable. These state actors sound impressive, they sound amazing, but oftentimes they win because we don't work together. They often win because we don't make the investments that we need. But if we stay informed about what those threats are, we work together, and we make the investments that are required, we too can protect our communities and our national security as well. So thank you for listening and hearing me out, and I'll move now to the closing out in the panel.
All right, thank you so much, Robert and Haley. And that's a great rallying call there for our delegates here today to, work together, make the necessary investments so that we can stay one step ahead of the game. As Robert said, we're going to move on to the panel discussion on the cyber threat landscape, and we're going to just delve a little deeper into some of the themes and key topics that Robert had initially mentioned. So I'd like to welcome on stage Mr. Zachary Tudor, the Associate Lab Director, National and Homeland Security Science at Idaho National Laboratory. He'll be on this panel. Ms. Sultanat Masharova, the Advanced Cybersecurity Architect at Honeywell and the founder of Women in Cybersecurity in Kazakhstan. And Mr. Marco Ayala, the Director of ICS Cybersecurity and the Sector Lead at 1898 & Co. Our moderator for the session is Mr. Andre Shori, the Chief Information Security Officer for the Asia Pacific region at Schneider Electric. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is your opportunity to pose questions and leave them your comments. So when the time is right, we'll be scanning the QR code if you haven't already, and leave us your questions. We'd love to hear from you. Microphones are already positioned along the aisle. Let me hand the time now to our moderator, Mr. Shori.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to once again be here at OTCEP 2023. A big thank you and shout out, of course, to CSA, to Minister Teo, and honored delegates. First of all, I just wanted to do a quick round of introductions before I kick off the questions. I'll start with Rob. Really, Rob doesn't really need an introduction at all. So I'll just say, hello, Rob. Hey, how's it going? Yeah, so that proves that he's not a recording. He's actually a real person. I'll also share that Rob is a frequent visitor to Singapore, as many of us know. He loves having a cold beer on a hot Singapore day in addition to chili crab. And as we all know, he doesn't hold back any punches when it comes to doing the right thing and ensuring that our OT industry colleagues all make it home safe and sound every night. And directing my first question to Rob. So Rob, using the number of threat actors as a benchmark, but from an overall perspective, right? How fast is the OT threat landscape actually changing? And in your opinion, is it faster or slower in comparison to, say, the IT cybersecurity threat landscape?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I'd say that the IT threat landscape has a higher frequency of attacks than we would have in OT. And I often say that there's a higher frequency of attacks, but a lower consequence. You're going to get more phishing emails in the company than you are going to have Trisis-like attacks, but the phishing email is not going to take down your country, right? And so it's higher frequency and lower consequence. Now, that doesn't mean it's a low frequency. There's a lot more happening than I think people realize. But when you talk about which is changing faster, I'm going to have a little bit of a controversial opinion and say that the OT cyber threat landscape is actually changing faster, which doesn't make sense at first with the lower frequency. But the methods and the approaches that work in IT are pretty consistent over the years. You know, I've heard people go, oh, what about AI? And again, I'm not downplaying AI. It actually matters a lot. But a standard crafted phishing email is still going to get you a lot of compromises across the community. So there's a lot of consistency. And there are some things that the adversaries are doing in IT that are novel, but there's a lot of overlap. In OT, I think that what we're seeing is, again, a lower frequency, but each one of these larger attacks has a lot more lessons learned just because we haven't had as a historical data set. So I would say that the IT threat landscape is not stagnant, but it is slower in changing than the OT threat landscape. And I think that we're starting to see kind of that tick up in that change where, you know, a lot of the OT attacks we saw was like natively using your functionality. Okay, fine. But then we started seeing things like pipe dream manifest, like just a couple of years after a Trisis, just a couple of years after the first ever cyber attack to take down electric systems. Like these are big novel events. And again, they're rapidly changing what we have to do. And I think that's happening at a quicker pace than we're seeing in IT overall.
Thanks, Rob. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
Well, gee, guess who it might be?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, good. Yeah, so Rob, you know, guess who might be having a comment? So, you know, I definitely agree. And seeing, you know, attack frameworks for OT, you know, takes us back, you know, 10, 15 years to the attack frameworks for IT. You know, I always tend to speak about one of my favorite academic papers. 2002, Stuart Sanford wrote How to Own the Internet in Your Spare Time, where he, you know, discussed what might be some future attack methodologies. And of course, people read the paper and started to attack us with those same things. Some of the other IT attack frameworks of long ago have given us some of the ideas for pipe dream, you know, that we see now. And when it gets out, people will have a roadmap to be able to plug and play different types of effects in this. And so, yes, that is a drastic change for the OT environment, one that happened in IT 10 years ago.
Yeah, I just want to say, Rob, that's probably one of the best speeches that, you know, that I've heard in a long time. The fact of the matter is,
I love you too, Mark.
Seriously, it's probably one of the most spot-on things that I've heard is the capabilities, the threat landscape, and the capabilities in the operational technology side. It's what makes the world move. And I think the importance here is that, you know, especially with these points, is that the out-of-the-box tool set for the automation side, especially from the automation engineering piece of it, very hard to detect. These are the type of things that keep me up at night. And we just have to be very cognizant of it, because all the things that you're doing at the enterprise level to do detection in depth, protection in depth, you're not going to have that visibility down at that lower level, those networks. So it's very important. And those 5 things are just spot on. Need to really focus on that to gain traction. Honestly, that's all we can do right now is just gain traction on trying to get ahead of these things. Because I too second what Rob's saying is, what's the next 4 years going to be like? And it's concerning, right? Because we have all these digitalization strategies that are going out. And I've always said the left hand is doing this, and the right hand is trying to catch up with security after the fact. So we really need to change our mindset in engineering and deploying out using those 5 principles, but also making sure that we're designing around failure and being able to operate effectively. So great points.
Thank you, Rob, for your talk. I would like to mention that, Rob, you mentioned about the architecture-wise that before it used to be completely different plans across the world. Right now, it's becoming more common protocols, common assets. It's not from attackers' perspective that the one plant is similar to other plant. It's also, for example, if asset owners has 20 refineries in the world, across the world, what they do is they do one OT penetration testing to the one side, and it is applicable to the 20 side, which makes, which Rob, you pointed out, this makes attackers' life way easier.
So I think we're going to speed up a little bit because I've noticed that our timer has been slashed considerably to 10 minutes.
It went.
So we're going to have to do the best that we can. So I think I'll forego the introductions and just go straight to the question. So Zach, in your opinion, how do we assess the reliability and accuracy of our threat intelligence to enable us to build and update our understanding of our respective cyber threat landscapes? What are some examples, perhaps, that you might have of reliable sources of OT cybersecurity-related threat intelligence that you use personally?
Yeah, well, as I sit here, and I'm the one directly in front of the big giant picture of some guy from Dragos, they might be a credible source, I'm not sure. But one of the things that I think that almost every industry has by now is an information sharing and analysis center where people in a common industry come together, work with professionals, work with organizations that provide threat intelligence, and then provide some additional context for that industry. So that is one thing that I've seen coming. There's an initiative, maybe I won't name it, but inside the federal government, I've been very concerned that sometimes industry has some of these sharing mechanisms and they're a 75 or an 80% solution. And they say, gee, that's not good enough, so let's try another solution. And so we go from an ISAC to an ISAO to what's the current thing, an ARC, and now another, rather than try and repair and grow the situation that we have now. So I would say I know that the OT ISAC is going to be here later on this month. And so once again, embrace the ISAC, help it get better. For those of you that have electric ISACs or other industry or utility-specific ISACs, work with them. And remember, they're not perfect, but they'll only get better when you participate and share that intelligence, share those best practices. So, that's one of the things that I would say.
Fantastic. Thanks, Zach. Question for Sultanat. Salt, how do we ensure that the end-to-end supply chain is secure when designing an OT cybersecurity solution? Right? You're a cybersecurity solution architect. Visibility over third parties is possible in general, but our ability to manage and monitor when we get to the fourth or even fifth parties drops considerably. So how do we create a system where resilience and resistance to supply chain attacks are built into the system?
Well, when we talk about supply chain risk, it's not static. So it changes across the different phases of the project, across different life cycle of the OT system. So for us, it's important to understand supply chain threat by accessing this security system components during different phases of the project and life cycle of the OT systems. Then, once we identify those components, we need to make sure to capture this to the supply chain map and create the SBOM and risk register, of course. And further mitigation we can include to include the vendor evaluation during different phases of the project. In addition to that, strong contractual clause. So I would like to mention here that CSA, CII supply chain program actually includes one of the 5 initiatives. They include contractual clause, which helps asset owners to have a baseline when they have when they're in the procurement stage or when they are going to upgrade their contract as well. So when it comes to the different visibility to the different tires. The same thing I would like to mention, it's another initiative which has been done by CSA, that once asset owners create their supply chain asset inventory, they can input to the toolkit by the CSA, and then according to the data modeling technique, they can have to the nth tire visibility of their OT supply chain. Further on, we can, of course, it's a mature procurement process to check the vendor reliability, quality of assurance, and how vendor quickly issues the software patches, software updates, taking into account compatibility issue. And eventually, one of the 5 controls, it's detection. Detection is a must.
Fantastic. So yes, absolutely. Traceability, I agree fully. It's key in being able to protect our secure supply chains. Mark, there's a universal agreement that protecting critical infrastructure is essential to every nation's ability to function safely and securely while delivering a quality of life experience appropriate to citizens' expectations. Right? I think that's a reasonable assumption. When designing the protection of critical infrastructure systems, how are these defenses different than from other OT systems in general? And what strategies should governments today take to enhance the protection of these critical systems?
That's a really good question. So I kind of struggled hearing the very last tail end of that, but I think I understand the full question. That the key piece there is building out systems that you know are going to be attacked, right? And you've got to be able to create systems around failure. I was fortunate enough to be mentored by folks that trained us extensively how to build around bugs before cyber became a thing. And Rob, you and I, we talked about this to great extent, where if we had a basic process control system, thou shalt use vendor A, and if you're going to have a safety system, thou shalt have vendor B. Not because of cyber, but because of bugs, right? Because if bugs in one system, more than likely it's going to be the same bug in the most critical system. So that thought, those thinking patterns around really cyber-informed engineering, building out resilient systems that, if and when they are compromised, can still operate, at least at some degraded form or degraded state, but still operate and not just operate blindly. And I think we've built a lot of systems in the last 10 to 15 years where they're so tightly coupled and tightly integrated. And I think that's great. The problem is that the high consequences of events that we're trying to protect against, we've exposed a lot of those too. And so I know Idaho National Labs been working on, consequence-driven cyber-informed, which stemmed from Mike Asante's great work and input. And I can tell you the respect I have from that strategy is understanding what is important to you as an organization, whether that's safety or that's production. And I think this is the way the government should look at this, is identifying what is critical and making sure you're building around failure, building around compromise. Because when we start talking about supply chains are going to get compromised. We know that. So it's very important that we build these resilient systems and we test these resilient systems and we bury them deep. Defense in depth strategy, doing the best that we can, because the differentiator right now is the fact that we are pushing so much digitalization. And Rob, you talked about this in your discussion, is that's the exposure, is that we're continuously putting things out there on the network, either integrated or even exposed. And so for us to really do better, we have to really deep dive into design engineering, in engineering itself, and having the security baked into that. Very important.
I think Zach wants
Yeah,
to add
one
as
of
well.
the things I want to mention, you talked about that heterogeneous, culture, becoming homogenous. And once again, we're following IT down the bad path. If you remember all the discussion of the monoculture, we ended up having, one flavor of operating system predominating across the internet, by Microsoft. And of course, you learned how to attack it once, and you could attack it a million times. But I think, once again, sometimes standardization, sometimes that harmonization is good, but we shouldn't have homogeneous protections. So, we need to make sure that we're not all using the same protections, even as we try to standardize on features and safety and security, but that we don't just all blindly follow the same methodologies for detection, protection, and response.
And Rob or Salt, did you want to add anything as well?
But I think I've spoken enough, and I'll use my like 5 seconds to just acknowledge Miss. I hope I pronounced it right, but Masharova. Like I've been able to know Zach and Mark for a long time, but I'm very honored to be with you on the panel, and so I default to you and what you want to be able to say.
Okay, in terms of, I would like to add to the Marcus point that cybersecurity should be baked in, but when we should start this cybersecurity requirements, it should start during the feed stage, which means before choosing your vendor. Yes, you don't have your HAZOP or LOPA studies available, but at least you can define your cybersecurity requirements.
Fantastic. Vendor selection, third-party risk management, all playing a key part there.
Yes.
Okay. We have 10 seconds left, so I think I'll just ask everyone for their final thoughts. Maybe we can start with Mark and work our way down.
Yeah, just exactly. The conceptual side of it before feed, pre-feed, really putting that in, designing around compromise is very important. So very well said, Salt. Thank you.
And I think I'll also go back to something Rob said, but Salt just mentioned as well. We have to start thinking about security by design, security at phase 0 of design, before selection of all the other features. We want security to be in line with safety, with features, with all of the other aspects of systems, rather than that afterthought, that that bolt-on that it has become over the years that we all cry about.
Any final thoughts, Salt?
Yeah, and as I said, Rob mentions this 5 security controls, which is critical. Before, it used to be patch all of your system, especially when, for vulnerability assessment, when Rob mentioned that you don't have to patch all of your vulnerabilities, which means if that vulnerability is creating loss of view, what does it mean to you? You need to connect this technical loss to your loss scenario in the process afterthought, whether you're going to patch it or not, to make a decision.
And Rob.
Yeah, and if I could just, as a final comment, I'd say, look, like for the audience, the OTCEP that's been pulled together, lots of amazing folks here. The talk on vulnerabilities. I remember Dale doing that years ago. Talk about SBOM. I mean, look at what Eric's doing these days. As you look at our panelists, I would say that if you look at across the OTCEP, there's the 10% that we all disagree with because we're passionate about something else, we're focused on something else, we think that 10% is really special. But the 90% of stuff that we consistently agree on are things that you should be going and doing. It is not okay in this day and age to say, well, I'm looking for the next big innovation to do this when you don't have the basics in place. This is something that deserves our attention because of our communities. I love the infrastructure community for a very basic phrase, which is we all live and work in the communities we serve. All of us want our families to be taken care of. All of us want our families to have clean and reliable infrastructure. Go put in the fundamentals and you too can win.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Mark, Zach, Salt, Rob. Fantastic having you on the panel today. Apologize, it was very, very compressed. I planned something a little more robust, but we do the best with what we have. And fantastic. And everyone else, thanks and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you.